This is the second video in the series Foundations of Literary Theory, and the topic of this particular lesson is psychological criticism. So psychology is the study of the mind, the development of the human personality from the moment of birth to the end of life, the cognitive and emotional structures of our mental space, as well as the various maladies that sometimes arise from them. For this reason, psychological literary critics tend to be most interested in characters and relationships, and oftentimes the minds of writers themselves, rather than questions of artistry or artistic development. So, in comparison to formalism from the last video, which focused primarily on the text and what the text says, psychological criticism tries to discover what is not said, at least not consciously or directly. It seeks to uncover the hidden motives behind actions and expressions. So a little bit of history is helpful here, some context. We'll start with Sigmund Freud, who is the founder of psychoanalytic theory. And this really started for him with the interpretation of dreams. Some of his earliest ideas about the development of the unconscious is presented here in this work, The Interpretation of Dreams, which he published in 1899, and then an American English translation of it appeared in 1913. So he wrote many things, of course, including literary criticism. Freud wrote essays on Shakespeare and Leonardo da Vinci and artists. We're not going to talk about any of that material here, but this was his first significant publication. He inspired a number of later critics. Many of these individuals knew Freud personally. Ernest Jones wrote a very, very influential article on Hamlet, applying some of Freud's concepts, particularly the Oedipus complex, part of the psychosexual development in early childhood. And that essay appeared in 1910. And then over the next few decades, he developed it into a book-length study of the play that was quite popular at the time. Very, very famous reading of Hamlet. Another example of Freud's influence would be Marie Bonaparte's biographical study of Edgar Allan Poe, where she psychoanalyzes him and his literary output, primarily based on his experiences with the loss of his mother and then his adoption by a cruel stepfather. They did not get along. One of Freud's students was named Carl Jung, and he developed what is called today archetypal theory. And he developed this in a number of essays in the 1920s and 30s, and these were all gathered together in 1969 in a single work, part of the collected works of Carl Jung, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. So that appeared in 1969. But before that, he was influencing literary critics. Maud Bodkin was one of the more well-known practitioners of archetypal literary criticism. This is her book, Archetypal Patterns in Poetry, 1934. And then Jung also influenced Northrop Frye. His book, Anatomy of Criticism, appeared in 1957. It contains 4 essays, and the third essay is titled Archetypal Theory. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's very complicated. We'll talk about it a little later in this video. And then finally, Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst, whom we'll talk about, but his principal book was called Archetypes. This was a collection of lectures. There were quite a few of these. Some of them were published in an English edition in 1977, a selection of his lectures on psychoanalysis, and very, very influential, particularly on literary criticism. So we'll talk about Lacanian psychoanalysis too in a moment. But we'll start with Freudian psychoanalysis first. And the fundamental to Freud's theory is the concept of the unconscious, the idea that there is an aspect of our personality that we cannot fully access or control. It's deep inside us, and that it takes the close reading of somebody who's trained in digging into the unconscious, the psychoanalyst, to manage the unconscious. But despite the fact that we can't readily access it or control it, it nevertheless shapes our desires and guides our actions. It's formed in early childhood in response to basic animal needs and appetites, primarily from Freud's point of view, psychosexual appetites, but later it affects our sexual development and socialization. So, very famously, Freud broke down the psyche into these three components. I give you the German words in the text boxes here, das Es, or the id. This is the most primitive part of the psyche, and it is the seat of animal urges and appetites. And because it is always trying to satisfy these desires, following what Freud called the pleasure principle, it operates without any thought of consequence, anxiety, ethics, logic, precaution, or morality. It's a totally selfish component of the human psyche. Then there is what he called the ego, das Ich. It regulates the selfish impulses of the id. It delays them or redirects them into more appropriate actions, and mediates between our selfish inner selves and social reality. So Freud called this the reality principle. Basically keeps the id from destroying our lives. And then finally, there's what Freud called the superego, das Über-Ich, that operates according to what Freud called the morality principle. And the superego imposes a sense of wrongdoing. And it appears in early childhood. It comes to us from our parents. And later in life, it comes from other institutions that impose rules that regulate our behavior. But they can also provoke feelings of guilt or inadequacy. And that is the source of a lot of neuroses, according to Freud. So those were Freud's basic concepts that are useful for looking at works of literature. Lacanian psychoanalysis is quite different. During the 50s and 60s, Jacques Lacan embarked on a substantial and at the time quite controversial revision of Freud's principal ideas. And the big difference is Lacan's emphasis on language as the basic material of the unconscious. This was a step that Freud did not take. And Lacan was interested in the role of language in the formation and maintenance of selfhood or identity. And this has made his theories especially attractive to literary critics, this emphasis on language, on the psyche as a linguistic construction. So whereas Freudian psychoanalysis is premised on the idea of a unified self, Lacan views the self as a linguistic phenomenon that is never complete or whole. And he identifies three stages. A lot of these theorists are really interested in the number 3. It's an archetypal number. He identifies 3 stages in the process of self-realization. The first is called the real order. This is the early pre-linguistic stage of infancy that is characterized by unity and completeness. The infant has basic or real needs that must be met, but does not yet recognize itself as an individual distinct from other people or objects, including its own mother. This is followed relatively soon by what Lacan calls the imaginary order. In this phase of development, the infant recognizes itself in a mirror. He calls this, Lacan calls this the mirror stage. And the infant now sees itself as a being that is separate and apart from other people. And so along with this illusory or imaginary wholeness, the infant looks in the mirror, says, "That is me, I see in the mirror." Along with that come feelings of separation and loss, or the Lacanian phrase or word is lack. The separation and loss that comes from seeing oneself as separate from the mother, a sense of difference emerges. And this coincides with what Lacan called the symbolic order. So the fragmentation that I was just talking about that occurs during the mirror stage is what makes language possible. So that is me, I see in the mirror, and whatever is not me is other. And that's another Lacanian term that gets used frequently, the other. I've even seen it used as a verb, to other something. So we assign names to whatever is other, to whatever is perceptibly different from ourselves. And this language is arbitrary and imposed on us by what Lacan calls the law of the father. And he talks about this sort of complicated notion of the master signifier being the phallus, the ultimate symbol of power that no one really has access to, but it gives meaning to other objects. So psychological criticism is most of all interested in the utterance, what characters say to other characters in dialogue, or what they tell themselves internally, that gives us insight into their concealed motives and neuroses. Dreams obviously play an important role as coded transmissions from the unconscious, but psychological critics are also focus on symbols as code for repressed psychic energies. So whether they're generated by the unconscious during sleep or developed through the process of artistic expression, symbols operate by displacement, the transfer of desire to an alternate person or object, or by the accretion of desires around a single object. That's a process called condensation. Because our psychic development is imbricated with our sexual development, according to psychoanalytic theory, critics often look for feminine ionic symbols, containers, perforations, and passages, as opposed to masculine phallic symbols, vertical, erect, penetrative objects. Sometimes that can be taken to ridiculous extremes in psychological criticism. So let's talk now about archetypal theory. And this really begins, as I said earlier, with Carl Jung, Freud's most famous pupil, who sought to understand the role of group experience in the development of the psyche. That is, experiences common to everyone and that transcend national and cultural boundaries and even time itself. These universal experiences form a kind of ancestral memory, a storehouse of knowledge that Jung called the collective unconscious, that is passed down through time from generation to generation. And we can't consciously access these experiences. Nevertheless, they speak to us and motivate us in unconscious ways. But they can be translated into something called archetypes. And Jung defines archetypes as universal images that have existed since the remotest times. I'll give you some examples of archetypes in a minute and put them in different categories. But archetypal theory, or sometimes it's called mythological criticism, encourages reading literary texts not necessarily to identify what makes them unique or original as artistic expression, but to look for patterns, repetitions, patterns of images, characters. They're not really interested in round or flat characters, but character types, events that recur across cultures and periods, types of stories that appear in pre-Columbian civilizations and also in ancient Egypt. Two civilizations that never encountered each other, yet they come up with similar stories and similar myths. And that was fascinating to Jung and archetypal critics. So rather than finding significance in what sets different literary works apart, the archetypal critic draws attention to what these different literary texts have in common. 3 of the most important archetypes developed by Jung have to do with the development of the psyche. And again, it's sort of interesting that a lot of these psychological critics think in terms of 3. But we'll start with what Jung called the animus and the anima. The animus and anima are the psychic qualities of the opposite sex that are buried in our unconscious. For men, it's the anima, it's the female principles, and for women, it's the animus or male principles. And this balances our dominant personality traits and allows us to relate to the world and other people, particularly people of the opposite sex. Another major archetype of the psyche for Jung is called the shadow. And this is the darker part of ourselves, the aspects of our personality that we deny or suppress, and we may even project our shadow onto others as an avoidance strategy. A lot of critics find this particular archetype very attractive, looking for it in literature. And then finally, the third component is the persona. And this is our public self. This is the image that we present to others. For Jung, this basically aligns with our biological sex, whereas the animus or anima is the opposite of that. So let's talk a little bit about different archetypes that literary critics look for. Again, these are symbols or narrative situations or character types that get repeated throughout the body of literature, not just Western literature, but world literature. So the idea of the hero, the scapegoat, the outcast, the virgin, the temptress. These, there are obviously more. These are just 5, and you can read more about these in chapter 4 of the textbook. So character types, also images and symbols, colors, numbers. I was thinking about the number 3 in Donne's poem, The Flea, for example. Elements. And by elements, what I mean, like fire, earth, air, water, shapes, certain shapes, and celestial bodies, particularly the sun and the moon. And again, the textbook talks about some of these universal images and symbols. And then finally, we could talk about archetypal situations. Situations that recur in literary texts over and over again, like the idea of the journey, I think the textbook calls that the quest. Death and rebirth, the curse, and sacrifice. I don't think the book talks about all these, but I wanted 5 examples so that I can make a symmetrical slide. So I came up with some more archetypal situations there. So we'll wrap this up by talking about Northrop Frye's contribution to archetypal theory. Northrop Frye's book, Anatomy of Criticism, hugely important, very, very influential in the mid-20th century. And his idea, essentially, was that all literary texts fit into 4 categories or mythoi that together comprise a central unifying myth or monomyth, and that everything, all literary texts could fit into this. It's very, very tidy, too tidy perhaps, but he links it to the seasons, that these mythoi go back to ancient times, and are grounded in our experiences with the natural world and organic life cycles, which we'll talk about. So we'll just put autumn and spring up here first. So spring he associates with comedy. This would be myths of generation, birth, awakening. And then autumn, as you might guess, is associated with tragedy, or myths of fall, separation, loss, and decay. And then we've got summer and winter. And summer is the season of romance. These would be myths of progress, order, and harmony. And then winter, associated with irony. These would be myths of chaos, darkness, and death. So if you're interested in archetypal theory, I would certainly start with Anatomy of Criticism, and this is a very, very simplified version of Northrop Frye's schema, his archetypal schema. It's more complicated than this. It has many, many more pieces, but this would get you started and kind of show you how an archetypal theorist thinks about literary texts. And that concludes this presentation on psychological criticism.